Okay, I want to welcome everyone to today's conversation and assessment policy update that we're bringing to you as part of NCME's committee that informs policy. The committee informing assessment policy, right? So it's a special interest group. We're going to tell you a little bit more about that, but want to welcome everyone that is joining us as part of NATP and the continued conversation that we started yesterday with our assessment policy update panelists that are joining us today are graciously enough repeating that session for us today for the NCME membership at large. So this is an assessment policy update. So I'm going to share that screen really quickly with everyone. And I think that everyone can see okay there. All right. So again, this is an NCME assessment policy update that we're bringing to you in combination with the NATP assessment community. And those of you that are not familiar, certainly our NATP members that are joining us today, I want to tell you a little bit about NCME, and they are the National Council on Measurement in Education. And that's a professional organization of individuals that are responsible for assessment, evaluation, testing, and other aspects of educational measurement. So they're basically the other side of the assessment community and the other side of the house that is responsible for a lot of the test design, a lot of the policy conversations, a lot of the more in-depth parts of assessment that as testing coordinators, we're not always necessarily privy to, but we are absolutely interested in learning more about. So in recent years, NCME has broadened its scope into an attempt to diversify both their assessment network and also try to do service and better service to issues around equity and fairness. So we want to help support those efforts. And we're going to talk a lot about that today during our assessment policy update. As I was mentioning and kind of fumbling through earlier, this session today is brought to you as part of the committee that informs assessment policy for NCME. And this is a group of assessment experts from different kind of areas of the assessment world that come together to bring important issues on assessment policy and the role of that assessment policy to that NCME community and leadership. So if you have not learned about that, want to learn more, hit up those websites at NCME and join NCME if you're interested. And there are a number of special interest groups, this one included, that welcomes input from the field. I personally am involved in the special interest group for the large scale assessment and state and local leaders of assessment. So those tie very closely to our K-12 work at NATP. And so we are absolutely thrilled to get into this conversation today to talk about issues around K-12 policy and dig into the impacts and implications to both our K-12 community and also to our NCME membership, including our researchers, our psychometricians, our professors, our state and local leaders, and how they also can help advance the discussions that are currently in consideration and are on the forefront. So today we're absolutely honored to have both Nicholas Munyan-Pinney from the Education Trust with us. Thank you for joining us, Nicholas. And we're also joined by Roxanne Garza, who is a Senior Education Policy Advisor with Unidos US. And for those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting, I am Elda Garcia, the Executive Director of the National Association of Testing Professionals, and also a proud member of NCME and special interest groups, including the CIAP. So we will get into this, to the kind of the discussion today and start with a few intros. So my personal background, aside from my current work with NATP and the work with the special interest groups with NCME, also I'm a partner with different organizations, including ALAS, which is the Association of Superintendents and Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents, and they do a lot. We partner with them on some work with education, with equity and fairness as well. But prior to that, I was in charge of assessment and accountability in South Texas and Corpus Christi, in charge of all that had to do with local and state mandated assessments. And so I was part of a regional and state assessment network in Texas, and ultimately became president, and then decided to lift our efforts to the national level to just support people with the work. So our work is all about supporting our testing coordinators on the front line to really just streamline the efforts, empower them with information, and help advance issues that are related to equity and fairness and related policies. So that is a little bit about me, and I'm proud to kind of be leading the charge with NATP and bringing important issues like this to the forefront to the NCME community and beyond. So Nicholas, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your work there at EdTrust?
Sure. So my name is Nicholas Munyon-Penny. I'm the Assistant Director of P12 Policy at EdTrust. EdTrust is a nonprofit organization that focuses on closing opportunity gaps for students, particularly students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. My particular work there is really focused on federal assessment and accountability policy, as well as our partnership with Education Resource Strategies, which is focused on 10 dimensions of resource equity. Prior to my work at EdTrust, I started my education career as a high school English teacher in New Hampshire, and then moved into policy working at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and Education Reform Now, where I also did assessment policy there. And I'll pass it to Roxanne to introduce herself.
Excellent. Thanks for being here again, Nicholas. And we'll pass it over to here with Roxanne to introduce herself.
Yeah, hi everyone. Happy to be here with everyone that's joined us today. My name is Roxanne Garza. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at Unidos US. We're the nation's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. We do policy work and programmatic work in a variety of issue areas, including immigration, health, economic development, and the team I'm on, of course, education. I work on both K-12 and higher education at Unidos US, but a part of my K-12 portfolio is looking at assessment and accountability and how they impact students of color, low-income students. So with our particular lens for Latino students and English learners. And then the other part of my work is more focused on higher education and making sure that our students are prepared to enter the post-secondary pathways that they choose. I've been at Unidos for about 3 years now. Before Unidos, I was at a research organization called New America. I focused a lot on educator quality and diversity there. And before that, I worked at an organization that provided extended learning time opportunities for middle school students across the country. So have been mostly doing different areas of education policy work over the last 10 years or so. Currently based in DC, but originally from South Texas.
Excellent. Well, we're certainly happy that you can join us and Nicholas as well. We're going to really get into today's conversation and pass it to Roxanne to really lay out our session goals as we're bringing together folks that are in the assessment world that are really on the front line of assessment with the testing coordinators that are joining us today, and also expanding that conversation to our greater assessment community that will include some of the audiences that we've kind of considered and started a conversation with on how our researchers and how our test designers and how our professors and how our state and local leaders can help continue this movement and these conversations that are happening that are policy related, and specifically as they affect our assessment and our assessment community. So Roxanne, lay out the goals for us for today, please.
Yeah. So we have a few things on the agenda today. We're going to start with a federal policy update. So just a couple of different items that have been coming out of the federal government over the last few months. So we'll start by talking about a Dear Colleague letter that the U.S. Secretary of Education, Secretary Cardona, released last September. And I'll kind of walk through what was in the letter and kind of the main message and takeaway there and why it's important. We'll then talk about a memo that also went to states from the Department of Education related to consolidated state plan amendments. So any changes that states were going to potentially make to their consolidated state plans and how it pertains to assessments and accountability and how it's related to your work. We'll also talk about something that you may have already heard of, the competitive grants for state assessment awards. So we'll give an update on those awards and some examples of what different places are doing with those funds. After that, we're going to have a bit of a discussion on national trends on this topic. So Nicholas and I both work at organizations that are kind of deep in the process of thinking about what the future of assessment and accountability look like. We've done, similar research with different, audiences. And this is something that has been top of mind for a lot of people at the national level, and I'm sure at the state and local level as well, with the inside the Department of Education on Capitol Hill. So we'll talk a little bit about what those discussions look like and what's kind of informing them. And then finally, we'll go through some key takeaways. So really kind of summarize, bring it home, like what is it that the call to action or activities and how you can get involved in this conversation, what that looks like as well.
All right. Thank you for laying that foundation for us, Roxanne. And so we're going to start with a dear colleague letter, and I just want to share with at least our NATP members who are on the kind of the call today is a reminder that some of this is really kind of part of a conversation that we've started historically with our assessment policy from last year, and then the ESSER kind of conversation that we had earlier this year. And so we're going to attempt to weave all that together. So if it's okay with you, we'll kind of reflect back on some of that and try to make some connections so that we can maximize our impact on related issues. So please, take it away here.
Yeah. So I'll start by talking about this dear colleague letter that I mentioned was sent out last September by the Secretary of Education that went out to states, and it was really focused on the intended role of assessment and the data coming out of assessment. So, I think as we think about the last several years and the pandemic environment that we've all been in, in 2020, we saw that the federal government pressed pause on assessment and accountability because of all of the disruption that was happening across the country. It did not make sense to have schools and educators on the ground kind of trying to figure all of this out on top of a public health crisis. The following year, we saw that, assessments came back, but without the tie to accountability, right? So there was this message that it's important to assess and have data and know how students are doing. But it also wasn't really reasonable to ask that be tied to accountability, again, in a moment where there was so much chaos and so much unknown. And now we're kind of in a place where we've brought back both of those pieces, the assessment and the accountability. And this letter in particular, I think, reiterated what some of the concerns still are from the federal perspective, which are the concerns about the disproportionate impact for students of color, low-income students, students with disabilities, English learners, a lot of the student populations that we've seen bear out in the data that were really disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and really calling on states and districts to use assessment data to try and identify students or student populations that really need extra support, and using the data from the assessments in that way, in that constructive way, not in a punitive way. So the letter specifically calls out, taking steps to reduce high stakes assessments and decisions based on those assessments. So things like graduation or promotion requirements, or the use of the data in educator evaluation. So all of the things that we normally think of as, the punitive ways that assessments are being used, the letter specifically called on the fact that we should be reducing those punitive uses and really using the data in a constructive way that's really used to guide resources to the communities that need it most, to really highlight where students are struggling and help target, again, resources for those specific students in those communities. I think that this is something that has been top of mind for a lot of people when they talk about, assessments and accountability. It's really the fact that sometimes those assessments and the data is being used in these punitive ways. And even though that's not necessarily required in federal law. A lot of times those are, state policies that are being set at the state level. And there's some, sometimes there's assumptions that it's really the federal government that is making states do that. And so I think this was one effort by the Department of Education to really lay out and reiterate, like, no, this is not how we want folks on the ground to be using this data. This data is important. It's important that we have it, but it's also important that we don't use it to punish students and educators. And this PowerPoint slide includes a link to the guidance page on the Department of Education's website. If you click on that particular link, it will take you to the guidance page that has a list of resources that the department has sent out, including this letter. So if you wanted to actually read through, the letter, that is definitely listed on that website.
Is there anything you would like, would you like me to click on it? Is there anything you would like to make reference to beyond what you?
I think, as long as it'll be something that gets sent around, right?
Mhm.
I think you'll send it around. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, once you click on it, it's a running list of different guidance memos. Of the things that we've talked about will be listed on there for folks to take a look at. If you wanted to read the letter and see explicitly what the secretary outlined in the letter, but again, kind of the high level summary there is that, there's some ideas there for how to be using the assessments and then explicit call outs on what not to use them for.
Excellent. And no worries on that. Our good friend Andrew Ho has posted a link to that in the chat. And I've also taken the liberty of adding a link to both today's presentation and the key takeaways that our presenters will leave us with today. So perfect.
Awesome. And one thing that we didn't talk about yesterday, but I think might be worth mentioning because we have some more state level folks on the call today, is one of the other things mentioned in the letter is the importance of reporting the data in a really clear and actionable way for stakeholders. So states have the responsibility of publishing this data in state report cards and doing so in a way that makes it easy for stakeholders across the education landscape, whether it be advocates, whether it be parents, whether it be educators, whether it be district and state leaders. It's really important that that data is presented in a way that it's useful for folks and can be compared across schools, across districts, et cetera. And the letter also sort of points to a few different resources for best practices on how to do that really well. So I'd encourage folks at the state level to take a look at those resources. I think could be really useful. And then digging into the next piece on our agenda is talking about the memo related to state plans related to ESSA. We know during the pandemic that there was obviously the pause in accountability that Roxanne talked about. And then as accountability started to come back, states were able to make sort of very short-term adjustments to their plans to particularly around the growth measurements, because we know there were years missing of assessment data that made it difficult to assess growth. So allowing states to sort of make those adjustments in their state plans. But in addition, I think a lot of states took this opportunity to pause on accountability as an opportunity to sort of like rethink what are the things that are really important to measure when we're talking about school quality, and also sort of how we measure various pieces, including around assessment. So states have the ability to make changes to their plan, make changes to their state plans and submit those to the Department of Education to get those approved. Those were due this past couple of weeks ago now, but those are still sort of pending with the department to find out sort of whether or not those pieces of those amendments have been approved. But I think it's really important for states of the folks at the state and district level to be sort of making sure they understand what those potential changes in your state are, so that you're aware of the implications that could be coming down related to changes in the way schools are identified for needs of improvement, because it's really important for ensuring that we're providing the supports we need to for students. So again, just make sure you're checking in with your state to get any updates as that comes along. We don't have a sense of when those will be approved now yet, but we also don't really have a sense federally of what those particular changes might be, but we do know that individual states may be publishing sort of what they've asked the feds to do. I know Roxanne presented an example yesterday of what Texas is proposing to have as their amendments to their state plans. So I don't know if Roxanne, you want to jump in and talk about what those adjustments were.
Yeah, and I will, I know I shared a link to this yesterday, so I will share this in the chat just as an example if folks want to take a look at something that shows what kind of changes states might be proposing. This is one from Texas, and again, it's a summary. Their site also has a more detailed outline, but I know one example of something we were providing some feedback on is this issue of creating super subgroups for the sake of accountability and kind of essentially consolidating some subgroups to reach higher numbers for accountability's sake. And I think for us, that's concerning, given that some of the subgroups that you would be consolidating have very different needs, but also understanding, you know, the issues with N size. So it is something that we kind of went back and forth with other advocates in the state. But that's just an example of some of the changes that Texas is proposing in their plan. There, again, the overview kind of runs through some of the other changes here, but you know, I'd encourage folks to look on their state education agency websites where something similar or very similar might be posted publicly at this point, whereas we don't have it at a national level from the Department of Ed yet. Your state education agency websites might.
Okay, I appreciate your sharing that, Roxanne, because I think that it's important for us to really note that we are really in this age where we're leaning on each other, right? So some states are watching the progress of other states to see how that unfolds for us to be able to extract lessons learned and what might potentially be a benefit and be able to kind of try to extract some best practices. And when it comes to policy, it's hard to do. And so I think that these things are really important. Thank you for sharing what Texas is doing, and we'll watch that unfold and see how that is potentially beneficial to those specific subgroups. Now, this next section is the one we were referring to, that during the beginning of the year, when we had our ESSER conversation that was tied specifically to how ESSER funds were being used toward assessment innovation. At that time, I think we were just really unpacking what some states were doing, trying to figure out, you know, what potential best practices were there, you know, heeding kind of some of those, you know, common national trends like, you know, formative assessments, and really trying to embrace some genuine innovation and see once again what we could learn from some of those states that were literally blazing the trail for us. So this will give us an update on where we're at now. Nicholas?
Yeah. Thanks. So there's really two main federal programs that are focused on assessment innovation. The first is the Innovation Demonstration Authority, focused on allowing states to have some leeway from some federal requirements as they do their innovation, but that program doesn't have any money attached. Whereas the competitive grants for state assessment, which we'll talk about today, don't have those sort of like waivers for certain federal requirements, but provides significant funding for states to really do the innovation work, which is expensive to do. So it's important that we're providing that funding for states. So the most recent round of funding was announced in August of last year to 11 different states, and we're going to highlight some of the really important ones today. I think one of the important themes throughout all of this that I'll highlight at the beginning is just the importance of making these assessments instructionally relevant for educators. I think that's what has been one of the perennial complaints, and we'll talk about this later in the presentation as well, that some of the assessments, while not designed to really be used throughout the year, it's something that I think educators are really wanting to get out of these assessments, because they want to make sure that they're able to adjust instruction to make sure students are successful at the end of the year on that summative assessment. So a lot of these innovations are really focused on providing that instructional relevance for educators. So for instance, in Louisiana and Montana, they're really focused on creating these through-year curriculum aligned instructions assessments. So what that means is instead of sort of having an assessment all at the end of the year, it's almost it's like a little bit broken up into parts that are taken throughout the year. And I think in Louisiana, it's about 3 to 4 times throughout the year, and those sort of build up to a summative score. And then in Montana, they're actually creating even smaller assessments that happen more frequently throughout the year, but are really closely aligned to what's actually happening in the classroom. The idea is that I think at the school level, educators will be able to decide sort of when to do each of these assessments, so they're aligned with local scope and sequence, and they're actually really embedded into like what's actually happening in the classroom, so they're able to use those results in real time to sort of inform what comes next throughout the year and make adjustments to support the students that need additional supports to get up to grade level achievement. Similar things are happening in Missouri and in Nebraska. Missouri is really focused on 5th grade math, while Nebraska is focused on science assessments and really making sure that those assessments are really connected to what's happening in the classroom. In New York and in Hawaii, they are focused on performance-based assessments. So there's also been a criticism that the way current summative assessments are designed, they don't allow for us to sort of get to that deeper sense of learning and sort of get to assess a more comprehensive, deeper critical thinking skills that aren't really available in sort of even on the most advanced multiple choice questions, or even on some basic written assessments. So these are really designed to allow students to engage in sort of complex and multi-step tasks to assess how well they're achieving towards grade level standards. So in New York, they're really focusing on piloting in a few individual schools and then thinking about how using that information to figure out sort of like what are the barriers, what are the best practices as far as scaling up these assessments, because they do take a lot. They're very resource intensive, both in terms of designing the assessments, but also in scoring the assessments as well, since they're such complex tasks. While in Hawaii, they're going to be keeping their traditional smarter balanced assessment, but then sort of accentuating that with a performance-based piece. One thing I'll mention from the EdTrust lens is that we are really committed to having some statewide summative assessments be a really comparable measure. That's the piece that allows us to make those sort of equitable resource-based decisions. And there's definitely some concerns and a lot of work to do to make sure that these performance-based assessments are valid, reliable, and comparable, considering there's many of them are sort of locally driven, and there's a lot of variation in what they look like. So making sure that we're still able to get that comparability is, I think, something that we're watching closely, and there's a question mark around whether that's really possible. So I think that's something that folks in the space will be keeping a close eye on as these innovations continue. In Louisiana and Illinois, we're seeing a real focus on English learners. So in Louisiana, they're focused on creating interim assessments for English learners. So under ESSA, in addition to sort of the traditional statewide assessments, states are also required to make sure that students are meeting English proficiency for English learners. And so this, there's already the summative assessment for that, but this sort of allows states to sort of see how students are doing throughout the year, so they can make adjustments to their language instruction to make sure English learners are getting that proficiency that they need to get to by the end of the year. And then in Illinois, they're doing something a little bit different, where they're focusing on creating Spanish language arts assessment. So they already have, they're already working on developing these in grades 3 through 8 and grade 11, but they're now focusing on doing sort of through year Spanish language arts assessments in grades 9 and 10 to again provide that sort of instructionally relevant feedback loops that I've been talking about. And this is particularly important here because it can be sometimes difficult for students who haven't fully mastered English to sort of demonstrate what they know in the content area when the test is in English. So having Spanish language assessments allows us to get a better understanding of the content knowledge that English learners have. So that's the reason that Illinois is focusing on this. And then the last piece that I'll highlight when it comes to the CGSA awards is that Arkansas, North Carolina, and West Virginia are working together to think about multiple measures when it comes to assessing students with disabilities as they move from that alternative state assessment to the general state assessment. Because we know that students with severe disabilities are able to take a slightly amended assessment from the one that most students take. It's supposed to be capped at just 1% of students. So we know in, I think, about half of states, more than 1% of students are doing that. So states are really focusing on trying to reduce the number of students who are taking the alternative assessment. And as a part of that process, it's really important that they're finding ways to assess students that allow for us to support students in the classroom. And that's what Arkansas, North Carolina, and West Virginia are together working on in this grant. And then the last thing I'll just mention is that in the last budget that was passed this past fall, there's about $20 million that will be available for this program coming up. Traditionally, the department has sort of combined 2 years of funding together, so we're not quite sure when the next round of funding will be available for states to apply for, but it's definitely something to be on the lookout for if your state is interested in doing some assessment innovation. And then if you're in one of these states, it might be worthwhile to sort of talk to folks in the assessment offices in your state to see if you're able to get involved in these pilots, because many of these pilots are really focused on scaling up and are going to be looking for districts to add to the assessment pilots as years go on.
That's a great add, Nicholas, because one of my questions was going to be, what are the implications for us as either testing coordinators or as researchers, state and local leaders? What are the implications for our existing assessments and accountability systems if we're going to take on these very costly innovations when we're looking at what it looks like on the field?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that if your district is doing one of these innovative assessments, particularly if they're in the subjects of English and math, where students are tested every year, students will likely be being tested twice throughout the year. So they'll be taking the traditional summative assessment at the end of the year, but then they'll, in addition, be doing these innovative assessments in order to provide the data that the psychometricians and states at the state level need to figure out sort of if these assessments are valid and reliable measures of student learning. And so because of that, there's sort of this double testing that needs to happen. And it's important to get that data, but it does create an additional burden for folks at the district and school level as they're administering multiple assessments. So one thing to keep in mind as that's happening is that it might be useful, particularly in states that are in districts that are doing these through-year assessments, to think about what are the other assessments that we do throughout the year that we might want to reduce, so we're not overburdening educators and students with assessments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent point, because this is our attempt to pull it all together, all our different sides of the assessment community, so that we get onto the same page and understand these processes a little bit better, so that we're more prepared and more equipped to have these conversations locally whenever we're approached either by a parent or by a student or by a local, a district leader, for us to come from a space of understanding to say, oh, I know exactly where that's coming from. This is why it's so important, and be able to clarify the purpose of what we're doing, because that's gotten muddy over time. So thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, so I will start our conversation here. Definitely welcome Nicholas to join in here on some of the work that both of our organizations have been leading around the future of assessments and accountability, but just wanted to get us started with some grounding context into kind of why we are at the place that we are in right now in terms of these discussions. So, one thing that is extremely important, and I think Nicholas talked about this on the last slide, is the ability to have data on students by subgroups, so by race and ethnicity, and by students with disability, English learners, different student populations that have different needs, and being able to compare that data, at least within the state, right? So from district to district. And so we know that annual statewide summative assessments have been able to reveal longstanding disparities that exist in academic opportunity and outcomes for historically marginalized students. And so we, that I think is where we have concerns around whenever, there are these innovative assessment pilots or different ways that we might be trying to assess, is that we're typically concerned about, okay, well, it's great. We definitely are excited by different innovations and states and districts trying different things, but we definitely want to make sure that we are able to retain the ability to have the disaggregated data and to be able, again, to kind of compare how students are being served by different districts. And so that remains kind of a very important equity guardrail from the civil rights perspective. It's something I think we fought pretty hard to get. And now that we actually have that data, we think it would be pretty detrimental if we went to a place where we no longer had access to that data. But at the same time, we know that our current accountability systems and interventions have not necessarily led to the large scale improvements in student outcomes that we would have liked to see come out of these different reforms. And so, I think we are finally at a place where a variety of stakeholders, including, the education and the youth development fields, are really grappling with a long-term future of assessment and accountability, and what that looks like. And I think, as Nicholas pointed out, different states are trying to be innovative and trying to pilot different ways of assessing students. I know that different, testing companies are also trying to think of different ways or thinking of different ways to improve upon assessments that we currently have, how or how not to tie those things to accountability. Again, going back to the conversation we had before, right? So in a lot of the conversations that we've had with students, with parents, with educators, a lot of times, there's no objection to the idea of having assessments and having the data. That's actually very important to families. It's actually, how the data is used, and when it's used in a punitive way, that people have, a very that's the part that's concerning, I think, to a lot of folks in communities that we've been talking to. And so a part of a project that we've been doing in partnership with the National Urban League, another civil rights organization, is really trying to get a sense of how communities of color are experiencing these assessments and these accountability systems. And so I think there's obviously always an intended purpose and an intention behind policy in general, but especially with federal policy, and then a very different way in how it might be playing out on the ground, and how it's and just kind of unintended consequences, right, that can come out of these policies. And so we've been trying to talk to different stakeholders, like I said, students, families, educators, at all levels, at school level, district level, psychometricians of color, and just trying to get a sense of, what's working for you, what's not. In an ideal world, if you could redesign the system, what would you change about it, right? And what would make it work better for you and your kids, or your community? And so we've kind of ended our phase one, which was really kind of a lot of listening sessions and reporting out of what we've heard. We're about to publish a report that will have some pillars that will reflect what we heard from our different stakeholders. And then this next phase that we are going to begin will be more focused on trying to take what we've heard and have that inform some policy recommendations around what we would like the next phase of this work to look like. And I think as part of that phase, we really do want to be engaging more testing, people like I'm sure are on this call. And I think the tension, or kind of the hard part, which is taking what we've heard, what we want to see, and then talking to professionals, experts in the space that can really tell us, like, so what's feasible and what's possible, right? Like, these are all the things we want to accomplish. That's great. These are the things that we value, but thinking about it practically and what's possible with testing, what's possible with, the systems that we have in place, like what are the different things that need to be considered and what might we lose if we do, X, and kind of thinking through some of those considerations. But I know Nicholas and Ed Trust has been leading like very, very great work on this too. So Nicholas, I'd invite you to preview some of the work that you all have been doing as well in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Roxanne. So yeah, like UNIDOS and National Urban League, we have at Trust have been doing very similar work. We also partnered with the National Urban League as well as Teach Plus, America's Promise Alliance, and Unite. And we really focus on talking to a variety of stakeholders, particularly students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, parents, families, and caregivers, as well as educators, and then district and state leaders to get their perspectives on sort of what's their lived experience with assessments, and then sort of like what are their recommendations for how assessments could be improved. And some of those sort of things that I think it's important to highlight that we found in that research. In particular, students and families really don't have a good sense of why they're taking these assessments, but they're very stressed about them, despite the fact that they have no idea really why they're taking them. And I think there's a real responsibility of folks at the state, district, and federal level to really make sure that we're really communicating what those purposes are. We saw in the Secretary's letter at the beginning of this call that that's something that the federal government is really trying to do, but it's important that we're sort of making sure that message gets carried all the way down to educators and students and families, so that they know that these assessments really aren't meant to be a judgment on them, but they're designed to help the system improve to better serve all students. That's really the goal of these summative assessments. So making sure that that message is being sent clearly to all stakeholders, I think is really, really important. We also heard from educators, something that we talked about earlier in the call, is that they just don't really feel as though these assessments are really maybe the best measurement of sort of what their students can know and can do, and that they're not really useful for them in the classroom based on sort of the timing of when they get the results, which is why we're seeing all these innovations around making sure the tests are happening throughout the year, as well as also talking about sort of the idea of making sure that reporting is sort of useful and actionable and understandable for multiple folks. But then we also heard from state leaders that this information is really important for the equity-based work that we're talking about, sort of one of the main purposes of statewide assessment. So, but again, making sure that those messages are being clear, and that there's actual like transparency and evidence of how these data are being used to support students is something that's really important. So we've done all this listening and sort of have compiled some of those findings that I just sort of went over. And then like UNIDOS, we're focused on taking this into creating these equity-based pillars that will sort of stand as sort of the guidepost for any sort of future federal action when it comes to assessments, either when we reauthorize ESSA in the coming who knows how many years, or even actions that could happen at the federal level before that. And then additionally, we're looking to release some specific recommendations of what the federal government can do in those areas to sort of address the needs that we've heard from all of these stakeholders. So that report from us will be coming out in about 2 months. So we're excited to share that with all of you when it's available. But I think it's really important to know that we're sort of making sure that the future of assessments is really focused on taking into consideration those folks on the ground, sort of what their experiences are, and making sure that the assessments and the results are sort of addressing those needs as much as possible within sort of the realm of what's possible, like Roxanne was talking about.
And so Nicholas, I'll invite you here to elaborate a little bit as it relates to parents and other stakeholders. I think in our previous conversation, we talked about how important it was to involve all stakeholders in these conversations and get involved at all levels. But you made specific reference to the communication with parents and kind of empowering them to advocate, and then also on a kind of related note on how kind of to get accountability to get distributed and make it to those people who are in positions of influence or power to kind of push some of these issues forward. What can you share with us on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take that parent piece first. So in addition to sort of one thing that we want to do is make sure that parents have sort of a clear understanding of the purpose of statewide assessments when it comes to those equitable distribution of resources. But we also think these assessment results are really important for parents to get a sense of sort of where their students are at compared to grade level. And this is really one of the only pieces of information that parents are getting that gives them that information. I mean, there are students obviously get grades from their classroom, but those also take into consideration other factors, including effort and things like that, that don't quite, and additionally, sort of those assessments may not always be exactly aligned to grade level. So this piece of summative assessment data is really important, and it allows parents and caregivers to really advocate for additional services that their student might need to make sure that they're getting the academic supports that are required for them to get to grade level mastery of various areas where they might need development. And additionally, it could help them advocate for advanced coursework opportunities in areas where they're doing really well. So making sure that parents are sort of armed with this data is really critical to making sure that students have the opportunities that they need. And then as far as the accountability piece, we didn't touch on that in the work that we're doing currently, but it's sort of where we're thinking about going next. And the work that we're doing when it comes to accountability is thinking about what right now the federal accountability structure is really focused on the school level and sort of puts the onus on individual schools to make improvements, particularly those that are identified as needs improvement, sort of those lowest performing schools in the state. But we know that there are sort of levers that schools don't really have power to move. Like they don't necessarily always, they can't always make particular decisions about sort of how many teachers they're getting if the district is making those decisions. So we're really thinking about what are those levers that districts are pulling that really influence school performance, and how can we maybe tweak the way that accountability systems are structured to hold those folks accountable to the pieces where they have the power to make change.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, Nicholas. I think that's a lot of what we heard from our conversation too, is this idea that educators don't necessarily, not want accountability, but they would like for it to be more distributed, especially among the stakeholders and the people in decision-making positions, and that have the power to make decisions about resources, about policy. So, really kind of broadening the way that we think about accountability and who is ultimately held accountable for these disparities and, the outcomes that we see based on these systems. So that's definitely something that we are thinking a lot about, and also glad that it's something that came up in your work, because that helps reinforce, I think, what the way that we're going. But I also want to just address, I think, some comments in the chat. Definitely agree that assessments are really just a tool that we have, right, to identify disparities, to reveal where there are gaps and where students may need extra support. They're not the way to actually close or even help narrow those gaps, but they are a tool to even just have that information. And the idea is, of course, that and again, we can talk about the fact that maybe that's not how it's playing out, right? But the way that this is supposed to work is that once you have identified where there are gaps, that is where you are using evidence-based interventions to support your students. That is how resources should be allocated or focused towards certain communities, right? That's how states should be identifying schools for comprehensive or targeted support. And I think what we are hearing a lot in these conversations is that, to some of the points in the chat, is that that's sometimes not what's happening, or at least not how people are experiencing what's happening, right? And so I think there's a major disconnect between, at least again, what the intention of the federal law is, on top of that, what ends up being placed or what ends up being put in place by the state, and then ultimately what schools and districts are able to do.
Yeah, those are really good points, Roxanne. I think there's a couple of things that I want to bring up here when it comes to sort of using accountability to sort of focus on that improvement piece, because we know really that right now it almost seems as though kind of the way that we're identifying schools just sort of like puts a label on them, and we don't really necessarily always feel that there's a support behind that. But really the idea is that there is sort of this support coming from ideally the state and district level to make sure that schools are improving. Currently under the federal law, 7% of state Title I dollars are designed to be reserved to go to provide additional resources to those schools that are identified as in need of improvement. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of like state evidence that how that is actually being done. And the other concern is that those additional funds really aren't making up for any are pre-existing long-standing inequities in the way schools are funded. So it really isn't necessarily making an impact that we want it to make because of that. And additionally, states already are required, quote unquote, to do allocation reviews with districts that sort of have a lot of low performing schools. Again, this is sort of like a soft requirement. They can do it they're just required to do it periodically without any sort of like set number of times of when this is happening. But that's really an opportunity for states to support districts and schools and making sure that resources are allocated in a way that supports the students most in need. And then another thing that I think is really important to think about is like, how can we use accountability systems not as sort of a hammer, but as sort of a tool for continuous improvement, sort of using it as a way to encourage us to continually getting better, not just in schools that are identified needs improvement, but in all schools, because we know that all schools have room to grow in various ways. So how can we use these accountability systems to sort of spur those conversations? I know that in Missouri, they're already starting to experiment with they actually are starting to include continuous improvement measures within their state accountability system to allow schools to get credit for the work that they're doing to improve their schools. And then that's still in its early days, but it's something that we're really interested in and looking at to see whether or not that's actually making an impact and helping schools improve through using accountability structures.
And so here, I think since we're kind of at the latter part of our presentation, we certainly have time to weave in some questions from the chat, and we'll go back to some of those. But one that really ties directly to the question to what you're saying now, Nicholas, is stating, and I'll read it to you so you all can each have an opportunity to respond. It's saying that regarding that Dear Colleague letter that we reference, what do you think would be their examples of constructive use of the results, and what would be their examples? What would there be examples of constructive use, and what examples of punitive use of results? The letter says now is not the time to lower standards for students. If a student receives a low score, is that punitive or constructive? If a school gets an F, is that punitive or constructive? The letter suggests that punishing students and schools for low grades is not advised, I think. but do you read the latter as suggesting that assigning these grades and categories is acceptable and possibly constructive? That's a loaded question for lots of reasons, right? But what would you say to each of those kind of parts? What's constructive, what's punitive, and what of these, kind of issuance of grades?
Yeah, I mean, Roxanne, do you want to go first, or I have thoughts, so I can.
You can go first, and I'll follow up.
Okay. So when I think of constructions, when I think of how we're using some of this results, I think when we're thinking of constructive, it's thinking about using them to, like I said, do continuous improvement. And for me, assessments are really focused on the system and not on individuals. So when we're talking about punitive measures, we're really talking about when we're using individual scores of students to make individual decisions about what can happen to those individual students. And similarly, when we're talking about educators, potentially the way that if we're heavily weighting some of the assessment scores into teacher evaluations, that could be punitively impacting those individual teachers. But I think at a systems level, it's really important to be using this data to identify where we have inequities, where we have issues of performance that need to be addressed. So I would not personally view giving a school an F as punitive, as long as we're using that rating to make improvements. And we're just sort of using that rating to shame a school and sort of say, you aren't good, then that is punitive. But the goal is for the structures to be designed to take the information of how the school is doing poorly and where they need to improve and build plans to actually improve that school. So it's designed to be instructive, but it's not it could be punitive if the system is not set up to create that continuous improvement that we're talking about.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I mean, I would echo all of that. And I would say, like, just in terms of examples, I think the letter lists out, some examples of the punitive uses, right? So things like decisions about graduation or promotion requirements, or the use of the data in educator evaluations for the sake of, are you using that data to fire teachers, right? Or and so I think in a lot of these places, or if for a lot of folks that we've talked to, like, those are the kinds of punitive things that they think about, not the, I think what we're saying are some of the constructive uses, which are, okay, you have this information, that should mean that your school now gets more resources to improve, right? Not less, or not that your school closes down as soon as it gets an F, right? And so I think there are all these different ways that we could be supporting schools that are getting these kinds of ratings or categories. I don't read it as we shouldn't be, giving grades or ratings either to students or to schools, but that what do we do with that information is the key part of that. So
yeah. And so I think we had this conversation yesterday as we had another policy update conversation around teacher evaluations. And that would be an example of kind of a punitive use of it when it is really very heavily weighted on student assessment. And I think that there is a lot of conversation around that, because even our very own Steve Cerisi, presented with us on some research, kind of referring to the fact that wasn't appropriate to do. And many have since said the same, but yet we still have states who are somehow making it work. They are being either creative about formulas, they're lightening up the weight, they're incorporating multiple measures. And there's other ways, like to your point, Nicholas, about kind of, taking that opportunity to both hold people accountable and still doing it fairly. And because I think there's a lot of people, kind of working hard on the front line. And so we already have a teacher pipeline issue. And so I think, that really is an important consideration. And is there anything said about that by way of policy conversations at your level that are attempting to provide any guidance for states as they incorporate assessments into their teacher evaluations and trying to maintain a more constructive results or outcome?
Yeah, so I would say that at a general sort of ed trust level, we're not wading into discussions about teacher evaluations and the role of summative assessments. We think at the federal level, it didn't really work the way that we wanted it to, particularly when we're talking about Race to the Top, where the federal government really incentivized states to take on including summative assessments and teacher evaluations. That sort of really backfired. And I think a lot of that had to do with the timing of it. So at the exact same time that the federal government was encouraging states to include assessments in their evaluation system, they were also encouraging states to adopt really more rigorous state standards and state assessments all at the same time. And so that really created a strong backlash, because teachers didn't feel like they were prepared to teach the new standards and also to the new assessments, while also being assessed on them in a high stakes way. And so combining those initiatives together at one time created a lot of problems politically for this type of work. But that's not to say that doing this can't work. Like I mentioned on the call yesterday, DC is an example of where they're really doing a good job, at least in my view, they're doing a good job of using some of the assessments along with many other measures to see how teachers are doing, and doing that in a way that really focuses on rewarding teachers who are doing a good job and contributing to student growth over time, and providing a pathway to sort of additional compensation. So, and I think that's a point I made yesterday, is that DC is doing this sort of, they have their impact system, but it's also associated with a really competitive pay package. Teachers in the District of Columbia get paid about one of the highest rates in the entire country. And those who are performing well with students perform better. And we've also seen that that system has allowed the district to sort of attract really high quality teachers from surrounding states and districts, as well as really retain those teachers who are doing them best for students. So we see it really work in DC because of the particular way that they've structured it, but that doesn't mean that it works in all places. So that's what I would add to that conversation.
Yeah, and so we're just kind of taking opportunity to weave questions in because our final slides are really just kind of wrap up and take away. So this is a question that is somewhat related, but still gets back to the ratings question. And that's what if the grades or overall ratings and the community pressure associated with them actually interfere with meaningful improvements? And is that even a consideration as federal kind of conversations, discussions, and policies are kind of grappled with? So I guess really any consideration to the pressure that comes with those ratings, right? And so we know we're trying to kind of find a balance in this entire accountability, system and considerations and trying to advocate for sensible policies. But there's a lot of pressure around that. And for me personally, I would think that education would help with this, right? For us to be able to involve stakeholders at every stage of the process, for them to understand, that there is kind of a delicate, balance between both, considering those ratings important for purposes of school improvement, but also being understanding of all that relates and contributes to that. And so I think that's, I'm not sure that's a policy question, but I think it's an opportunity for us to really engage and invite both, stakeholder input and involvement at every stage, but for us to be able to advocate and also at all those levels to be able to inform and empower people with information to have and engage in those conversations, right? So that was one question that came out of there. You see any other questions we have here? I think we're pretty good on questions, so I'll kind of take us here to the key takeaways for each of you to respond.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll add one thing to that piece. I really think that you're right about really engaging stakeholders, and I think the other piece that's really important is that transparency piece. So I think there can be a lot of mistrust that comes within communities when they don't have an actual sense of what's really happening in schools and don't have an understanding of sort of how the data is being used to improve schools. And so it's really the onus is on the district and on the state to make sure that they're being clear about what the data is, how it's being used, and then inviting folks from the community to be an active participant in that conversation and really jointly create the solutions that will improve schools, rather than sort of closing that off and making it hard for us to understand, so that folks are just pushing pressure onto the schools, but rather working together as a community to improve those schools, I think is really, really important. And I agree that I don't really know that that's a federal policy decision. I think that really comes down to sort of folks on the ground really being committed to doing that tough work. It's not easy, but it starts with being transparent and honest about the data that's available.
Yeah. And I would also add that I think that's also where it's the importance of, again, I think we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but the idea of all of these systems being informed by multiple measures. So I think, we talked about how important that is, with students. We don't want, a summative assessment to be everything that we, hold the student accountable for, or teachers to only be, evaluated based on their students' assessment scores. And again, even schools or school systems, the fact that, the state summative assessment, or the way that students are performing on an assessment, proficiency rates, all of these academic measures should of course be a very important measure of how we measure schools. But there are all sorts of other things, right, that schools provide for kids and for families. What kinds of opportunities students have at that school. There are just, I think when we think about, families and the kinds of schools they want their kids to be in, like, they're not just thinking about, what are the test scores of the kids that are going to this school. There are all these other aspects of, like, is my child going to a culturally affirming school? Do they have opportunities to engage in other aspects or other enrichment opportunities, right? So I think there are all sorts of ways that we could look at schools more holistically in thinking about like what goes into these ratings. And I think that could also help with some of like the pressure that comes along with like, well, why did this school get an F or why did this school get an A if it doesn't do X, Y, or Z? And so I think, again, kind of going back to the point of the importance of multiple measures, I think could help there as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to raise that many of these multiple measures are really most if not all can be incorporated into school rating systems right now. The federal government under ESSA really allows for a lot of flexibility when it comes to how states are rating schools and how they're identifying schools in need of improvement. So states can sort of do that as they're amending their state plans year to year to make sure that they're creating this like holistic picture of school quality, and that can happen now. I really want to jump into Regina's questions around sort of maybe identifying areas or entities of need without grading schools. I think one of the real reasons that folks have gravitated toward rating schools is that because of all these different ways, complicated ways that we measure school outcomes and school sort of like how school quality looks like, it can be very complicated. There's a lot of crazy formulas that are used at the state level to sort of figure out like exactly where schools fall. And so in order to sort of make it more clear for stakeholders, that's sort of like where the grades have come from, sort of to take all of that really, really complex information and sort of package it into a more understandable label or sort of grade. I think is sort of where that comes from. I think there's a lot of opportunity for states to think about sort of if that's the right approach, and are there other ways that we could present the data in a usable, understandable, actionable way that doesn't necessarily involve grading. I know some states are really focused on more of a dashboard approach that might sort of have individual grades for individual aspects of school quality. I don't know that that's something that I personally would support, but I think there's sort of room to sort of think about sort of what that looks like. And again, I think it really comes back to sort of like how we're taking that information and taking that grade and then using that to spur improvement. It's not necessarily about the grade itself. Anything else you would add there, Roxanne? We can also, there's a couple other questions too that we can address.
No, I think that's right. I mean, unfortunately, I feel like sometimes in policy we gravitate towards simple, either broad or simple ways to, like in this sense, grade schools, right, to not overcomplicate something that is already kind of undergirded by a complicated system, but agree that it would be helpful to think about different ways that we could categorize schools based on the data that they are showing without necessarily the A through F system, right, or things that we already are so ingrained in us, right, that like an A is good and F is bad. And so maybe there are more just creative ways to think about that. I'm sure there are.
Yeah, and John, I want to get to your question about particular examples of building understanding. I think one that really stands out to me, I don't have a ton of sort of like good solid data on this, but it's really as student-led teacher parent conferences, I think are a really strong way of sort of building this understanding of student achievement and student growth, where teachers and students are working together, teachers are working with students to explain sort of what their assessment results mean and what they mean for growth, not just the ones at the end of the year, but the ones that happen throughout the year. And then when parents come in for teacher conferences, the student is the one that leads those conversations, and they're able to articulate what they're learning and what their growth is and what their scores mean. And so together as a group, we're able to come to a sort of a clear understanding of what this data means in actuality and how we can use it to improve student outcomes and student growth.
Great. Do you want to take a crack at that most recent question there from Andrew, who's saying that one thing, back to the competitive grants, Nicholas, one thing he didn't see obvious in the competitive grant program is additional measures and indicators. What about student ratings? What about social and emotional outcomes? What about broader systems of assessing educational systems and equity beyond ELA and math tests? Do you see good examples of this within or beyond those competitive grants?
Yeah, so right now, CGSA is not focused on those additional measures. They're really just focused on innovations within various types of academic assessments. I mean, it's very possible that I don't think it's like without outside the realm of possibility that the feds could decide that they can change their priorities of what those competitive grants are for. I'm not sure if they actually have the ability to sort of move beyond the academic assessments, but I do think there's a room potentially for the federal government to invest in innovation in those spaces as well. We definitely want to see additional outcomes when it comes to sort of that additional measure of school quality and accountability systems. So we need to sort of figure out what are some reliable, valid measures of social and emotional learning or other student outcomes that could be incorporated into potentially that could be incorporated into accountability systems or at least reporting systems. I honestly don't have a good sense of sort of which ones are the strongest, but I think it's a role that the federal government could play in sort of supporting the development of those. Though I don't know if CGSA is necessarily the vehicle itself for that.
Makes sense. Good. I think you guys have done a fantastic job of weaving in most of those questions. I think the other one was just a couple of times a general call for a more balanced and holistic, accountability system rather than the current requirements. And I think that's the general feel. I think that's duly noted, more measures, more considerations beyond, kind of the very complex formulas that hide behind those very simple ABCDFs. I think we have oversimplified the letter grading because it is quite complex underneath. And so I think that as we move forward, and I'll let you close with the key takeaways here, and then we'll open it up for more questions if anyone wants to unmute and free up their cameras when we're done here with the formal presentation. Nicholas and Roxanne, if you want to kind of close with your key takeaways, and if you'll include there, if you will, what are the calls to action, right? Here we are, a fairly comprehensive, slice of the assessment community. We have testing coordinators, we have researchers, we have professors, we have state and local leaders. I've seen them all in attendance today. What would your calls to action be as you give us these key takeaways on informing the assessment policy issues that are in consideration at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with this first piece that we have here around the messaging, the purpose of summative assessments. Like we've talked about throughout the call, sort of the main purpose of summative assessments is to identify inequities in student opportunities and making sure that we're using that data to address those inequities. But like we also talked about, those purposes are not always clear to all stakeholders at all levels. So I would encourage folks on this call to make sure that they're helping spread those important messages about sort of how assessment data is supposed to be used, and additionally, use your platforms to sort of push on state leaders to make improvements to make sure that the assessments are continuing to be used for those purposes, or be doing a better job of making sure that they are used for the purposes rather than those punitive ways that we've talked about.
Roxanne, you want to add?
Yeah, I would say I would definitely echo what Nicholas said. I think the biggest barrier, and I think, to some of the questions in the chat about like how do you kind of adequately or effectively make sure that families and students and parents are educated or more knowledgeable about the use of assessments or kind of the role and the purpose. I think as groups at the national level, we're trying to do a lot of that engagement. A big focus of Unidos US is parent engagement and trying to really help students or help parents advocate for themselves and their students, really knowing kind of their rights, the fact that they have access to this information. They should have access to this information. The information should be provided to them in a way that is easy to understand, it's easy to access. And so I think if that's not already happening in different places, I think we're all trying to do more to make sure that parents are equipped with what they need to advocate for themselves and their students. But I think, again, just kind of taking home that message around the role of assessments or the intended role, and the fact that, we don't want these systems to be used in these punitive ways that we talked about, because I think that continues to hurt the entire cause here, right? Of the fact that we want to have multiple tools at our disposal to identify where there are gaps for students and really be able to help them learn or help them catch up or help them kind of, close certain gaps for them where they need. And so I think this messaging around the role of assessments and accountability is really, really important. And I think, again, as Nicholas said, I think it's also a big thing around the other updates that we talked about is really just trying to get more informed about what's happening in your state and how it directly applies to maybe your particular role in a district or in a state or as a researcher, how those changes to consolidated plans, or if your state is doing one of these, pilots for assessments, like what's happening there and what can you be either learning or how is it potentially going to impact your own role within your system?
Yeah, the one thing I would add is also like you're part of a network. That's where this is coming from. So there are folks within the network who may be in states who are doing really interesting, innovative work. And I think it's important to sort of leverage the community that you're a part of to sort of hear from what other folks in other states are doing that you could learn from and advocate that could be useful in your state too.
Appreciate that. And you did make reference earlier, Nicholas, about kind of heeding the opportunity to seek out the education agencies, find out more about the amendments. Is there any final kind of calls or for opportunities there on learning more about what's going on within your respective state and understanding how that is related or functioning within the flexibility that states have as far as federal policy goes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to sort of take that into consideration within the context of the conversation we've had today. We really think that there are a lot of ways that accountability systems could be improved to really focus on that continuous improvement. So I think it could be useful to sort of reach out to your state Department of Education, sort of figure out what are those changes that folks are sort of focusing on having implemented now, and then also use that as an opportunity to sort of advocate for the changes that you think could be made to your state's accountability system in the future. Like I said, there's a lot of flexibility within ESSA to sort of make a lot of changes around how schools are sort of rated and how we judge school quality. So I think there's always an opportunity to sort of take what's in the state plan and use that with what you've learned today and in other places to advocate for better policies that will help improve students and schools. So.
I appreciate that because there are state and local leaders on the line. And so they will absolutely know to expect those questions. And I think it's just such a great opportunity, one, to demonstrate the transparency that you have emphasized here today, and also an opportunity to help empower all of the soldiers out there, right? We are the messengers. We are kind of the people that are on the front line, oftentimes that are helping our parents that you have kind of held in such high regard here as part of this process to understand where this is coming from. So we're able to kind of help support the understanding and empower them with information. So when the F's and the D's do arrive, then we all come from a better place of understanding and are prepared to support our schools for the improvement that they need. So that I think takes us to our final key takeaways document that I've also shared in the chat by way of a link here that our panelists have left us with, basically kind of a compilation of today's presentation, all in a single page handout of information for us to kind of take away today as part of the conversation and help us to kind of just continue to talk about and lift up these important issues as they relate to assessment policy, because they're affecting everything that we do on a daily basis, whether we are the researchers or we are, the testing coordinators, the boots on the ground, or the state, the state kind of education agencies that are kind of enforcing some of those policies. It's affecting us all. So we absolutely want to thank you for your time today, and we'll open it up for more questions if we should have them. In the PowerPoint, their contact information is here if you should require more information, but I'll pop off the shared presentation in case anyone else has any other questions that they would like to share. Feel free to open up your mics before we let our panelists go for the day.
I'll just also reiterate that, I'm sure both of us will share our reports when they're published. So, would appreciate sharing them with with this group and yesterday's group. We're always, even after the published report comes out, always open to feedback and to reactions. As I said, for us at least, this first report is really a phase 1 of our work, and there will be a phase 2. And so I could see opportunities for us to, again, engage folks that are part of this community that I think would have really valuable things to share and add to inform the recommendations that we'll be working through.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And we will gladly invite you this time next year for an update on all of the issues that we've kind of brought to light, and we'll certainly help support in any way that we can from our respective kind of vantage points and parts of the assessment community.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely would love to continue to engage with the community as we think through sort of what comes next. And I'll also address Andrew's other question in the chat, because it's one that I think that folks in the federal policy community are thinking about a lot as we're trying to convey that message of sort of what is the purpose of assessments, because that real clear purpose of using assessments to identify inequities and then using that data to drive continuous improvement can, like Andrew said, really fall on deaf ears if we're not actually seeing that improvement happening. So I think something that I know that EdTrust is really thinking about is, so how can we identify those proof points of where we're actually seeing assessment data be used to make equitable decisions. We heard in the focus groups that we did as a part of our research that state and district leaders really are using this data in ways to make more equitable decisions about how they're allocating resources. But those messages and those actions aren't really making it down to the folks that sort of we want to make sure that they're getting to. So I think a part of that is sort of calling on folks at the state and district level to be really transparent about the decisions that they're making with these data. And then I think one thing that we're sort of at the national level focused on is really reaching back out to those folks and seeing what are those examples and how can we sort of illuminate those examples for folks at the national level so that we can see what are the levers that folks are already pulling using these data to make changes, and then use that information as well. So in addition to sort of doing that messaging work, to think about how we can improve systems to do a better job of doing that writ large.
Excellent, and a fantastic stopping point for me, and a great closing remarks. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to free up your mics or pop them into the chat before we let our panelists go for the day. Any final questions or thoughts? Okay, let's see here. Not sure if that was a question. No, I think really just general thanks in the chat, and I certainly want to echo that and thank both Roxanne and Nicholas for their time across the last 2 days to talk about assessment policy, and more importantly, how we can be of assistance in the process. Right? I think we absolutely appreciate all of your information, guidance, and recommendations, and we'll certainly heed that call and take those opportunities at every level. We have local people here, state people, and national kind of experts, and I think we have opportunities to engage in those conversations everywhere we turn. So we'll certainly do our part, and thank you again for your time. Thank you everyone else for joining us today, and we encourage you to keep up with what's going on with NCME. We have a conference coming up here soon at our annual meeting in Chicago. We will see you then, if not before. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.